Okay, our final presentation today comes from a pair who probably don't need much of an introduction, but I'm supposed to give them one anyway. Evidence-based change, and that's going to be Ashley and Andrew.
Okay, just going to share my screen. How's that going?
Yeah, that's good.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Good afternoon to you all. It's really great to hear the excellent work being progressed in Dufford Powers, Cleveland, Hampshire, and South Wales. I'm Andrew Wilson, and some of you may have seen myself and Ashley Liggins previously at the Process Evolution Conference talking in another capacity about demand forecasting, crime, and harm. But we're now here to talk about how can we develop this concept further by integrating with research. So we've worked in policing for nearly 30 years between us. Latterly, I've been at the National Police Chiefs Council, and Ashley's continued her work as one of the most formidable senior analysts I've had the pleasure of working with. And we've decided to take the jump and pursue our passion in evidence-based change, and have set up our own consultancy to assist with this. But of course, we're not here to talk about that today. We just want to give you hopefully some useful insights into evidence-based policing, and hopefully challenge you about how you can potentially incorporate even more of these opportunities within your work, particularly where you're trying to maximize evidence-based decisions using the Process Evolution toolkits. So we are strong advocates, obviously, if you've seen us here before, with the solutions offered by Process Evolution to improve decision making. And we obviously feel that evidence-based policing, or EBP as it's sometimes abbreviated to, can complement the design, scenario modeling and implementation work that you all support with. So question with this slide really is, have you ever had your work and analysis referred to as the dark arts before? Well, we have, and it's something that we're keen to try and help demystify. Although I'm a bit disappointed that Process Evolution didn't offer quiz bonus points for guessing the reason behind the inspiration for our company name, but we'll leave that for another day. Very briefly as background, we've been involved in organisation-wide operating model redesign, implementation, full change lifecycle support, forecasting demand and resource requirements throughout the uplift period. And we've used most of the Process Evolution toolkits over the last 5 years. And what we're doing now, one of the things we're doing now is we're going to take on roles as academic tutors at the Cambridge Centre of Evidence-Based Policing. There's no doubt, like you, we want to have informed decision making that helps reduce serious harm in the communities we live in. So in a world of constrained resources and increasingly complex demand that's been referred to over the course of this conference, we need to focus on doing what works, consider what's promising, and certainly not do what does not work. There's just simply are not enough police officers and staff members to deal with every crime that occurs. So we need to think about prioritising and making the best of the resources that we do have. So for us, it's about improving outcomes. What can we do more with the resources we do have? How can we reduce serious crime and prevent harm to victims? And EBP, that's what it's all about. There's some fantastic opportunities, and I'm sure you'll be familiar with some of these concepts.
So if you're not aware, evidence-based policing is gaining more traction in the UK than anywhere else in the world. There's a growing body of research and resources which are now more accessible than ever, and the gap from academic theory is being bridged with more evidence being published from those who are actually working right now within the policing, not just in the UK but also internationally as well. So an evidence-based framework for applying evidence-based policing could be described as the Triple T strategy. This helps policing to move away from the 3 Rs, so random patrol, rapid response, and reactive investigations. The difference in preventing and responding to crime is that proactive work is ultimately rewarded with less reactive work. So basically less demand on policing, such as less crime and disorder. This helps build police legitimacy and also allows more time to be spent supporting victims. So what is targeting, testing, and tracking? Targeting. This is about applying good analysis to direct limited resources to predictable concentrations of crime and harm in order to affect that crime and harm. Testing. Once you've identified those predictable areas and those high priority targets, police should conduct or assess evidence to help inform how best to approach that problem. And then tracking. So this is probably more of an emerging area in policing, one that forces don't always have the capacity to be able to do, but is really important. It's about understanding what activities did or did not happen in relation to the crime and disorder and how successful or not successful those activities were. This is essential in building strong evidence, either for or against activities, to deliver better policing through use of that evidence.
So there's some really good examples, of course, of forces committed to enhancing the knowledge around evidence-based policing. Durham, West Midlands, Hampshire, to name but a few. We're shortly going to be working with Dorset on a stop and search experiment to understand if increasing the amount of persons stopped and searched in high violence areas will reduce serious violence, as well as also reducing the racial disparity that currently exists with police stop and search activity. So we're looking forward to some good insights from this work. It will be a randomised controlled trial that takes place over an extended period of time, but that's just to make sure that there is integrity with the research, and therefore other forces will hopefully be able to take advantage of any learning from it. And we do appreciate that forces involved in these kind of experiments, it's a significant investment for them, but really important if you can nudge your own organisation to do that and help continuous improvement in policing generally, because it helps forces stay on top of demand, and investing in good decision making provides obviously excellent benefits, not just for your own force, but hopefully good practices shared wider beyond that. So I referred to the dark arts earlier. Often in policing, we're asked to do a bit of magic, pull a rabbit out of the hat, with the various requests that we've got, short timescales, help the organisation deliver more with less, and if you can, make it evidence-based. There was an occasion where a chief officer said to me that pulling a scabby myxomatosis rabbit out of a hat was good enough, but I think maybe there's different ways of means of being able to achieve the end outcome. Well, I'm hoping everyone's heard of Daniel Kahneman. He's a Nobel Prize-winning psychologist who happened to author a slightly challenging to read but very interesting book called Thinking Fast and Slow. So the concepts in here have been quite interesting for me. One of the main premises being that there's two types of thinking that we each have a preference for, System 1 and System 2 thinking. Neither is necessarily better than the other, but it's about, can we learn to be adept at using the right one for the right circumstances? So System 1 thinking is about fast, operating automatically and thinking with little or no effort. System 2 is about paying more attention to effortful mental activities and doing complex calculations. You're probably not surprised to know that System 1 thinking is a preference that's more prevalent in policing, based on the nature of many of the roles that exist, of course. So an example for me around this is there was a previous police and crime commissioner who was very keen to have a shiny new response hub and quickly allocated a multi-million-pound budget to progress this. Thankfully, we managed to get in there and before there was any signatures on the dotted line, and we managed to convince those with a System 1 thinking preference that in these circumstances some System 2 thinking was a good idea. Ultimately, we saved multi-millions of pounds and improved performance at the same time. So we use tools such as facility location plan and response profiles to demonstrate how actually we had an existing site that was bang in the middle of the best location for improving response times if we were able to use that as a response hub. And I suppose the results speak for themselves.
So the deterrence of crime takes policing back to the philosophy of Pelian principles. But firstly, how do we understand the impact of harm on society? It's very easy for policing to continue to do what it's always done, which is largely focus its analysis on the use of aggregate crime volumes and rates. But actually what we're starting to see now, and it's nice to hear people talking about it today, is looking at things differently to how we have looked at it before. So Larry Sherman argues that to simply sum crime is misleading, with little meaning unless all crimes are created equally, of which it is argued they are not. For example, would you consider an aggravated burglary equal to a theft offence? I don't think that you would. By structuring crimes into a weighted index, this could be more usefully applied to allocating resources, informing risk assessments, and in the prevention of crime. To do this, it needs to be easy to do, not too expensive, and reflect views and processes within society to ensure there is legitimacy to the approach. There have been, and there are currently, many methods that have been proposed to do this. The one that has seen the widest use in the UK is known as the crime harm index. So how would you go about calculating a crime harm index? So first of all, you would start by using starting point guidelines from sentencing tariffs. This allows you to reflect the nature of the offence rather than that of the offender. So the reason why you'd do this is if a victim has experienced a robbery from a first-time offender or by an offender with previous multiple convictions, their experience is likely to be very similar. So by taking the starting point guideline, you translate this into a number of days, and this becomes the value for the crime. This can also be done for things like fines and community orders. What you can then do is multiply your harm score by your crime volumes, and this is when you start to build up your picture of harm. The map you can see on the top right-hand corner is a 3D view of crime volumes in Birmingham. Now look what happens when you see a 3D view of crime harm. Don't skip it all, Andrew. Do you start to think differently about where you would focus your resources when you start to see images like this? So if you already have a crime harm index in your force, or perhaps once you have some kind of crime harm index or way of looking at harm, what do you then do with it? So we move on to the first of the 3 T's, targeting. Within experimental criminology, this focuses on finding ways to reduce the harm from crime. However, few experiments produce evidence of large effects on the interventions tested. A solution to this problem may be in concentrating on the power few or applying the Pareto principle. So roughly 80% of the harm comes from the vital few. You can see from the statistics on the screen what this looks like for places, victims, and offenders. So research tells us that there are a small number of places and offenders that contribute to the majority of harm, as well as a small number of victims who experience the most harm. Rational choice theory and routine activities theory both hold that crime rates are a product of criminal opportunity. It is thus thought that by increasing the number of guardians, decreasing the suitability of targets, or reducing the offender population, the crime rate should decline. For example, some would hypothesize that the opportunity of crime was reduced due to COVID and that people had to stay at home. And as we all know, there's been a significant decline in crime during this period of time. So it kind of supports these theories that are held in criminological literature. However, concentrating resources on the power few, it's argued that these might be the most difficult problems to resolve due to there being like simultaneous problems and complex challenges. This is not just true for people, but also places with harmful characteristics. Some people would advise making these types of cases the priority, as there may be better chance of success with less complex cases. There is also the moral and ethical dilemma, which you've probably heard a few times in policing, in that not only would it draw resources away from elsewhere, it could also give varying levels of response across your force area. However, in thinking this way, and this is the opposing argument, this would ensure that the power few would continue to cause the majority of harm, therefore leaving it unchecked. The power few strategy is therefore a paradox, in that the best chance of successful results may be found with those cases most likely to fail. But this is where research comes in, and power concentrations are predominant in policing literature, with evidence building up of that picture of what works, what's promising, and what isn't. So thinking about your organisation, do you have this level of analytical understanding in your force, and do you regularly apply it? And when you have got this far, what do you do with it next? So let's move on to what research tells us about policing in high harm places. So with only 3% of places contributing to 80% of your harm in, I suppose, your force area, and it's probably very similar across forces, it really helps to know where these are. And did you know, once you've identified this, that that hotspot is likely to be hot for the next 8 to 10 years? They rarely change over time. Research also shows that so looking at hotspots policing, at visible patrol and associated activities, I'm just going to talk about some of the experiments that have been done in hotspots policing. So within the Minneapolis experiment, someone called Chris Coper looked at thousands of visits and has come up with what's now known as the Coper curve. You may or may not have heard of this before. But this has showed that for every minute after 7 minutes spent visibly patrolling, this gives a long effect of deterrence, right up until 15, so between 7 and 15 minutes of patrol. And then after this, you get what's known as a deterrence decay. What this means is it's a useful tool in not wasting police resources. So if you prioritise your patrol time between 11 and 15 minutes, you probably don't need to do any more than that, and it gives you about a 75% reduction in a risk of crime. The Philadelphia policing tactics experiment also showed a crime concentration problem in places. But what's interesting about this experiment is that whilst over 100 hotspots were identified, so there would be across like small policing patches, only those that had 6 preceding violence offences within the identified period of time were the ones that would get kind of the best results from the hotspots policing. But any less than that, then the results reduced with the less number of crimes. So the argument is, whilst perhaps 100 hotspots might be identified, perhaps not all of these needed the same amount of policing. A more recent study in Western Australia by Geoffrey Barnes and Simon Williams, they've been trying to understand the sweet spot in policing. So trying to do as little as possible, but achieve the biggest effects. So best maximising how they use their resources. Using hotspots policing with 15 minutes per visit, even just one a day had amazing effects with benefits over the next 4 days, to include reduced calls for service by 24%. But if you left it to the 5th day, all hell would break loose, with crime harm almost becoming 5 times higher. So just looking at the chart on the right, this is a systematic review of 79 studies. And what this does is it provides significant evidence for hotspots policing. But what it also shows is that the deterrent effect also extends to, in many of the studies, to the surrounding areas as well. So many people would say, oh, crime just moves around the corner, but actually what the evidence suggests is, well, in the majority of the time, actually it doesn't. So a recent statement from a police officer in another study who was asked to patrol in a hotspot was where he said, he perhaps wasn't as keen on the evidence and said, every minute I'm in this hotspot area, I'm not doing my job at protecting people. So unfortunately for the officer, but fortunately for the public, the officer was exactly where he needed to be. Within Barrack aerial study, so at the British Transport Police, hotspots policing had never been done here before. 115 stations were located and they were allocated to get treatment or not. Police didn't have to stay for a long time, and this was only across 4 days a week, so it wasn't particularly onerous on the force. But what they found was that the majority of the deterrence that they got was long after the police left. So 94% of the deterrence came from the after effects of a police officer having been there. And they didn't only get it on the station platform, but they got it in the entirety of the station to include on the floors above. So this also supports this kind of deterrence effect extending to the surrounding areas of where you're doing the visible policing. So knowing those kind of brief examples of what would be a few of many, many, many studies that are kind of being published all the time, I want to ask you to think about when you use the process to evolution software and when you're informing change within your organisation, are you able to make best use of this evidence? I think you could probably easily see how you could build these activities into your workload profiler or your ramp profiler and start to understand the resource implications and the cost involved with making some changes within kind of your policing activity. You could even look at it for what you want to stop doing, so you could actually then build in the capacity for the time to do this evidence-based policing. You could even test out what this means for response times. So in previous work that we've done, it was found that actually the hotspot locations and your optimal patrol locations pretty much sat on top of each other. So not only do you get the benefits of visible patrol, but you also get the benefits of improved response times, which we will show later in a further slide, the extra benefits that you get from having improved response times.
Okay, so now on to offenders, although the point around why hotspot patrols appropriately directed to the evidence-based targeted areas, why they don't continue to take place in many force areas is a little bit frustrating, I think. So sadly, some elements of evidence-based policing are based on predicting future harm from past offending. But it's still important to make best use of the information that we have got to prevent future serious and harmful offences occurring. I mean, there's 3 mugshots there showing some unsavoury characters. From left to right, you've got Gary Allen killed one partner. As soon as he got out, killed another partner. Colin French attempted to murder his partner. When he got out, he then attempted to cause serious harm to his new partner. And then you've got Theodore Johnson, who didn't just kill one wife, but killed 3 wives. I think we have to ask ourselves, can more be done to tackle harmful offenders? There are, of course, plenty of evidence-based tactics that can help. Clearly, staying up to the minute with the changing risk of harmful offenders is important, and that's a challenge for organisations, of course. But tracking offenders going in and out of that most harmful few is essential. Making better use of the prison's PINS data to find out who's coming out soon and planning a few weeks ahead to have a strategy in place to manage those individuals. It happens in some areas, but it doesn't happen in all areas. And making sure that victim protection strategies are developed and put in place. Very briefly, one Cambridge Centre for Evidence-Based Policing study is being progressed at the moment, which is supporting the probation service with a polygraph trial. So the hypothesis being that the use of a polygraph prior to release of a domestic abuse offender will act as a deterrent to reduce serious harm in future. So we obviously await the outcome of that and see what is happening there. I just wanted to again discuss the point around other techniques. So random forest forecasting is something you may have heard of, and this is for some people you may have better retention capacity than my brain in terms of how much information you can consider at any one point in time when you're making a decision. But of course there are computers can consider thousands and thousands of different pieces of information to be able to better predict future risk. And it's used not only across international policing in a kind of an emerging capacity, but also within our NHS at the moment, in terms of being able to more accurately predict and diagnose cancer with the use of random forest forecasting than a traditional consultant can. So an example in the UK policing field, though, is Durham's Harm Assessment Risk Tool, or HART, which forecasts whether a suspect is likely to commit a serious offence over the next 2 years, i.e. be a high-risk offender, any other offence over that 2 years, or a moderate risk offender, or predict no offences will be committed and a low-risk offender. So with the model that Durham have developed over time, they can be 98% sure that the worst-case scenario will not happen, i.e. that they all predict that somebody who is low risk actually going on to commit a serious offence. And the main purpose of the tool is to minimise mistakes within the moderate risk group. So these are individuals who would otherwise be diverted onto a checkpoint programme which aims to tackle the root cause of offending and offer an alternative to prosecution in the hope of turning that moderate risk offender into a low risk offender. And you're probably aware that there's a significant amount of evidence base for restorative approaches, reducing reoffending and improving victim satisfaction. Within the Durham HART model, the random forest analysis improves the accuracy of forecasting risk compared to the custody officer using their knowledge and professional judgment, improves that risk forecasting by about 14%, but importantly, it also reduces the amount of worst case scenario of serious incidents occurring that were not predicted. And therefore, if they weren't predicted, then safeguards weren't put in place to address that risk. So the confusion matrix, which is what it's called on the right-hand side of the slide there, this one's from Philadelphia, in fact, but with regards to a domestic abuse risk forecasting model they have. But these models are developed to take into account that not all errors are equal. So although this Philadelphia model is a little higher than the Durham model in terms of its overall forecasting accuracy of 69%, which is the sum of the true positives in the 34% in the left box, top left box, and the false negatives in the bottom right box. The worst case forecasting accuracy is higher, which is perhaps not so good, but 4.3%. This is where you hadn't forecasted any future risk of offending, but something actually happens. So whilst we know the overall forecasting accuracy can be reduced by focusing on being highly accurate in a specific area, Durham have obviously taken the view that actually it's much more important to be focusing on that specific area of high risk offences, and that is what helps identify those needles in the haystack, and so they can do something about it and avoid those who pose the highest risk of going on to commit further offences. So yeah, we've talked a little bit about prevention, but what about detecting crime in the unfortunate event that you become a victim? Well, as the infographic shows there, each minute you shave off the grade 1 response time, that equals a 12% improvement in the likelihood of detection in the case of urban burglary cases. And if you happen to be able to have an additional vehicle responding, then that boosts the arrest odds by another 33%. And I know that the single and double crewing debate is an emotive subject, but I suppose we're probably aware that with some changes to working practices through COVID, that there have been more single crewed vehicles as a result of that. Whether these changes are maintained is another question, but the simple reality is that more single crewed vehicles equals denser patrol cover, shorter response times, and more people are caught red-handed. And the evidence doesn't support any difference in the risk profile to officers being single crewed rather than double crewed. So just kind of following on in the burglary solvability factor considerations, the police are 21 times more likely to catch an offender if the witness reports the burglar breaking in compared to the victim reporting the burglar leaving. And I think if we kind of start to think about some of these aspects, we can see how the solutions offered by process evolution can really help make a difference. i.e., there are genuine improvements to detections and satisfaction if we can improve response time. So, as I'm sure, as we've heard today, trying to make the best use of response profiler, facility location planner, and even Zymes around the shift patterns can improve performance and outcomes. And as was mentioned briefly by Ashley earlier, within the work we've done, we've also incorporated directed response patrol plans within the design of the response model. So making sure that your officers, when they're not responding on emergency response or patrolling in the hot spots at hot times, makes a big difference to be able to get those response times down. And we know it can be a challenge to deal with that natural gravitation that occurs with reverting back to the station in between response. But this is where the importance of tracking comes in to ensure compliance, being able to monitor that GPS, to be able to see those performance improvements, which is what the public would expect at the end of the day. In terms of solvability factors for burglary, as an example, the key ones are: is there a witness? Is a vehicle stolen from the property? Is there DNA, fingerprints, or footwear recovered? So you're probably not surprised to know that in the majority of burglary cases, unfortunately, there are no solvability factors. And this helps with the triage situation and ultimately making best use of resources around what is allocated for further work. You could kind of categorize it in three areas: the unsolvable weak cases that really there is no actual benefit in allocating for any further investigation. You've got the strong evidence, which is obviously the one solved with little effort. And then you've got the moderate evidence cases that are solved with sufficient effort. So over the years, we found that there's standard policy decisions for the allocation of crime investigations that's based on crime type. We'd like to suggest consideration is given to exploring alternative allocation policies based on a combination of high harm offences and the presence of solvability factors. And that will help make better use of resources and can in fact be included within the workload profiler scenario modelling of what resource reductions could follow if you change to more evidence-based working practices.
So just to open it up for discussion, we'd like you to either tell us about your experiences of integrating evidence-based policing practices within the process evolution toolkits, or if, having heard some of the brief information that we've been able to share today, whether you think there are opportunities to do so and what opportunities those might be.
Stunned silence, I think. I just wanted to say thank you very much to Andrew and Ashley for talking today, and just from Process Evolution's perspective, we're very keen to have the opportunity to work alongside Andrew and Ashley, because there is that clear link, as Andrew's just articulated, in that it's, as well as getting your right resources in the right place, having the right numbers of those available at the right times, and the benefits of clearly intuitively getting there faster to an incident must be a good thing from a customer satisfaction and a detection point of view, but actually be able to back that up with some researched evidence that that is the case. It's just one example of where actually, rather than just relying on professional judgment, have professional judgment backed by research and evidence that that's the right thing to do. It makes the case for what we do far more compelling. But I think I've always tended to think in the past, and we've always said, well, we combine our expertise with senior police officers' professional judgment. But I think really, even just from the talk that we've just heard, perhaps senior police officers don't always know as much as they think they do about what works and what doesn't work. And I think there's just a big opportunity from combining this sort of evidence-based work with the evidence-based work that we do, which is why we're discussing how we can work together.
Yeah, just very briefly, if people are interested in learning more, there are some really good development opportunities out there. One of these being the intelligence analyst apprenticeship. So it's funded through the apprenticeship levy, so there's no additional cost to forces. So there's a really good year-long program that has an excellent work-based project that can help implement some of the evidence-based policing practices back in police forces. But otherwise, at the moment, they've got a ridiculous situation where forces are returning this apprenticeship levy back to the Treasury, when there's probably some really good opportunities out there to be able to work on your development and skills, but also hopefully it benefits the force in the area that you live and work in as well. There's a relatively small force that's just returned £350,000 worth of apprenticeship levy back to the Treasury. So that there's some really good things out there anyway that I would encourage you to lobby for the levy in your force area. And if you want any more information on that, please do contact us. I suppose just in summary, the systematic use of the power few evidence in targeting compared to the subjective allocation of resources will improve public safety at less cost. The testing of police practices will show what works, what doesn't work, and what's more cost effective. I think we're all frustrated with those things that are doomed to succeed. And the design work is really important, but implementation is also critical. So tracking is essential to ensure you get the delivery of actually what works. So we do thank you for your time, and I hope you'll all continue to be evidence-based champions in your respective organisations.